This is the second playthrough video for the 1 to 4 player cooperative adventure game, Travelers of Storia. If you haven't seen the first playthrough video, I recommend watching that first. This video will showcase the multiplayer aspect of the game with two of my friends, James and Dayton, playing it. James will be playing the champion class, and Dayton will be playing the rune mages. This mission's rating is bronze and silver, which means we'll be facing more powerful silver-rated enemies, but also recruiting silver-rated travelers and acquiring silver-rated treasure. You can tell a card's rating by looking at the colored border surrounding the card's portrait, or by looking in the lower right-hand corner. Looking at the map setup information for this map shows that we'll need a mix of 15 terrain cards, 4 campaign event cards, and 1 Nexus card. The map has been laid out, and it's time to start exploring. The first terrain revealed is the flourishing grasslands. Dayton rolls a 3, which means they'll both be facing a world enemy random encounter plus 2 enemies, and they'll get a treasure card as their victory spoils. Since this game is being played 2-player, each player will start their first combat turn by putting the top 2 cards of their combat decks into 2 of their 4 empty awaiting deployment slots, and they'll face 4 enemies in every random encounter. This encounter has plus 2 additional enemies, for a grand total of 6 enemies. Once the 4 front row enemy slots have been filled, the remaining enemy units are evenly distributed amongst the enemy reserve slots. Check to see if any of the enemy units have an icon that matches the icon on the terrain on which you're currently fighting. If they do, they get whatever bonus is listed next to that icon, and move them over in their slot. These enemies are fighting on familiar ground. They're ready to start combat, and James has decided to take his first turn. He starts by putting the top 2 cards of his combat deck into his empty awaiting deployment slots. I'll keep a running tally of how both players take their actions. James takes 1 action to draw a card, then takes 2 actions to deploy a skilled smithy in front of the accursed specter. Then he takes his final action to deploy his bashing soldier in front of the pilfering dreader. He's taken his actions and now has to decide attacks. James decides to have his soldier attack the nearest dreader and to have his smithy attack the huge vermis. Now that James has taken 4 actions and decided his attacks, it's time for Dayton to start his turn. He'll start by putting the top 2 cards of his deck in his empty awaiting deployment slots. Then he'll take 1 action to draw a card. He'll then take 2 actions to deploy an experimenting alchemist in front of the other pilfering dreader. And finally, he'll take his final action by drawing a card. For his attacks, Dayton will choose to have his alchemist attack the huge vermis. Now that both players have taken actions and decided attacks, it's time to roll for energy abilities. The players roll a 6, and none of the enemy or allied units use any energy abilities. So now it's time for allied units to attack. The bashing soldier deals 2 damage to the dreader, fatiguing it. If there are any connected enemy units in reserve slots, they are immediately moved into a front row slot as soon as the enemy occupying that spot is fatigued. The smithy and alchemist deal 2 damage to the huge vermis, which would have fatigued it if it were not getting an additional energy for being on familiar ground. The enemies have begun attacking now, and the dreader deals 2 damage to Dayton's alchemist, which survives because James' smithy has a passive ability which gives other deployed allied units an additional energy. The brush viper fatigues James's bashing soldier, the accursed specter deals 2 damage to James' smithy, and finally, the huge vermis deals 1 damage to both James and Dayton's combat decks, since it's unblocked. The top card of both of their combat decks are fatigued. It's the next combat turn, and James takes 1 action to draw a card. Then he takes 2 actions to play an Allegiant Pikeman in front of the Brush Viper, then takes his last action to use Skilled Smithy's Outfit the Weak action ability, which gives deployed novice units an additional energy. He chooses to have his Pikeman attack the Brush Viper and his Smithy attack the Vermis. Dayton's turn to take actions. He takes all 4 to deploy his gold-rated unit in front of the huge vermis. For his attacks, he chooses for his alchemist and Talman Corcel to attack the pilfering dreader. The roll for energy abilities this turn is 7. The vermis uses its Screeching Bite ability, which gives it a bonus attack and makes it evade this turn. Both the dreader and brush viper are fatigued by their attackers. Talman receives 2 damage from the vermis, and the skilled smithy is fatigued by the accursed specter. Because the alchemist is no longer getting an additional energy from the now fatigued smithy, it is also fatigued. It's James's third turn to take actions, and he takes 2 to deploy his field medic in front of an accursed specter, then takes another 2 actions and draws 2 cards. He chooses to have both his pikeman and field medic attack the accursed specter and completes his turn. Dayton takes an action to use his Master Elementalist's Shock of Lightning ability. Since it's adept at the ability, it can use it while awaiting deployment. It deals 1 damage to the Vermis, fatiguing it. The man-eating spider is moved into the empty slot immediately. Dayton takes another 2 actions to deploy his Experimenting Alchemist into the last empty deploy slot and uses its Soothing Concoction energy ability to remove a damage from Talman Corcel. Dayton chooses to have both his Alchemist and Talman attack the man-eating spider. The roll for energy abilities this turn is 9, which means the Master Elementalist uses its Fire and Ice ability from awaiting deployment, which deals 2 damage however Dayton wishes to distribute it, and the Field Medic uses its Resuscitate ability, which lets James choose a fatigued unit and return it to the bottom of its owner's combat deck. Both remaining enemy units are fatigued, and James and Dayton return their remaining units on the encounter mat to the bottom of their combat decks in any order. They receive a Potion of Fortitude as their victory spoils for defeating this encounter, and then it's time to continue exploring. James and Dayton decide to move to the first campaign event for this mission. James and Dayton will have to face a campaign enemy random encounter, plus 2 additional enemies. A couple new silver-rated campaign enemies make an appearance in this encounter. Once again, James chooses to take his turn first and puts the top 2 cards of his combat deck into empty awaiting deployment slots. He takes an action to draw a card, takes 2 actions to deploy his Allegiant Pikeman in front of the Chanting Shaman, and takes his last action to deploy his Bashing Soldier in front of the Rock Slinger. Both of his deployed units attack the Chanting Shaman. Dayton puts the top 2 cards of his combat deck into his empty awaiting deployment slots, then deploys both his Novice and Elementalist units into the remaining 2 empty deploy slots. Both his units attack the Rock Slinger. The roll for energy abilities this turn is 12, and no units use any energy abilities. Both the Chanting Shaman and Rock Slinger are fatigued by attackers, and because damage is dealt simultaneously, James and Dayton can choose which slot to funnel the reserve slot Treacherous Brawler into. They choose to bring it in front of the Soldier. The Soldier is then fatigued by the Brawler, the Elementalist receives 2 damage from the other Brawler, and the Novice is fatigued by the Saboteur. Another turn, and James takes an action to draw a card, then takes his remaining 3 actions to use his Allegiant Pikeman's Impale action ability, which deals 2 damage to any front row enemy unit. He chooses to deal the damage to the destructive Saboteur. He then chooses to have his Pikeman attack the unblocked Brawler. Dayton takes an action to draw a card, takes another action to draw again, then takes his remaining 2 actions to deploy the units in the remaining empty deploy slots. Both his Novices attack the Saboteur, and his Elementalist attacks the Brawler it's in front of. The roll for energy abilities this turn is 10. James's Allegiant Pikeman uses its Piercing Strike ability, and he chooses to deal the damage to the Brawler in front of Dayton's Elementalist. Both the Brawler in front of Dayton's Novice and the Saboteur are fatigued. The Quarry Slave comes down immediately, and the enemies attack, fatiguing both Dayton's Elementalist and his Novice. James' turn again, and he takes all 4 actions to deploy his gold-rated unit, Tamara Dragonsbane, in front of the remaining Treacherous Brawler. He chooses to have Tamara attack the Brawler and his Pikemen attack the Quarry Slave. Dayton takes his first 3 actions drawing cards, then takes his last action to deploy his Scholar of Antiquities in front of the Quarry Slave. The Scholar and his Novice attack the Slave. The roll for energy abilities this turn is 8, and Tamara can use one of her energy abilities, but the enemies are going to be fatigued from attackers regardless, so the encounter is over, and the exploration will continue. James and Dayton decide to move to the next campaign event on the map. James and Dayton continue their search for Jonas Alger and move to the Colossal Peaks next. Upon rolling an 11, they trigger the Cliffside View event, which lets them take a look at any unexplored map card. They discover the expansive forest terrain card, and next move to the Nexus map card, where they both get to recruit a traveler to their combat decks. Either player may choose one of the travelers and put it on the bottom of their combat deck. Once a player has chosen one, the next card from the traveler deck replaces it for the next player to choose from. Once each player has chosen a traveler card, the remaining travelers are shuffled back into their deck and the exploration continues. Players can move freely amongst already explored map cards, and James and Dayton decide to head south from the second campaign event, and they discover the secluded Nexus Gate, where each player takes a traveler card from the top of the traveler deck. Dayton receives Tristan, Master Tactician, and James receives Bazul, Aldoran Crusader. With their freshly recruited travelers, James and Dayton decide to explore the expansive forest they discovered from the Colossal Peaks. They roll a 3 and trigger the Lost in the Woods event. Players must shuffle their decks and then face a world enemy random encounter, plus 2 enemies. After setting up the encounter, we can see that both the Feral Yar and Man-Eating Spider are on familiar ground, and will be able to use their energy abilities off of extra numbers. James will take his turn first and puts the top 2 cards in awaiting deployment. He takes an action to draw a card, then takes 2 actions to deploy a field medic in front of a ravenous zombie, then takes his final action to deploy his bashing soldier in front of a pilfering dreader. He chooses for both of his units to attack the zombie. Dayton's turn, and he puts the top 2 cards in awaiting deployment. He takes an action to draw and gets the Clairvoyant Proctor, which has both players play with the top cards of their combat decks revealed. He then takes another action to draw again. He takes an action to deploy his Proctor in front of the Feral Yar, and takes his final action to put a Novice in front of the Brush Viper. He has both of his units attack the Dreader. The roll for energy abilities this turn is 7, and the Feral Yar uses its Ferocious Chomp ability, giving it a bonus attack and making it evade this combat turn. Both the Ravenous Zombie and Pilfering Dreader are fatigued, and since they're fatigued at the same time, players choose which slot they would like the Man-Eating Spider to fill from the reserve slot. They choose to put it in front of the Field Medic, and enemies then attack. The Spider deals 2 damage to the Field Medic, the Novice is fatigued by the Brush Viper, and the Proctor is fatigued by the Yar. James takes an action to play Ayara, Mystic of Rani, in front of the Feral Yar, then takes an action to draw a card, then takes his remaining 2 actions to deploy his Allegiant Pikeman in front of the Brush Viper. He chooses to have his soldier attack the Spider, his Medic and Ayara to attack the Brush Viper, and his pikemen to attack the Yar. Dayton takes his first action to use Talman Corcell's Blazing Rain ability, which deals 1 damage to each enemy unit, including the top enemy unit card in reserves. He then takes another 2 actions and draws 2 cards, then takes his final action to use Tristan, Master Tactician's action ability on himself, which lets him look at the top 4 cards of his combat deck, put any number of those cards on the bottom, and the rest on top, in any order. The roll for energy abilities this turn is 7 again, which means the Feral Yar evades and gets a bonus attack. James chooses to use Ayara's Evade energy ability instead of Pollen of Rani. Both the Man-Eating Spider and Brush Viper are fatigued, and the Accursed Spectre in the connected reserve slot immediately fills the emptied slot. The Spectre fatigues the Allegiant Pikeman, and it's time for players to take another turn. James takes 2 actions and draws 2 cards, then takes his remaining 2 actions to deploy Bazul, Aldoran Crusader, in front of the Accursed Spectre. Bazul and the Field Medic attack the Accursed Spectre, and the Bashing Soldier and Ayara attack the Feral Yar. Dayton takes an action to have his Master Elementalist deal 1 damage to the Feral Yar, and decides to not take any further actions. The roll for energy abilities this turn is 9. The deployed Field Medic uses Resuscitate, which lets James choose a fatigued unit to return to the bottom of a player's combat deck. And Dayton's Master Elementalist uses Fire and Ice, which lets him distribute 2 damage however he chooses. Both the remaining enemy units are fatigued. Deployed Allied units and Allied units awaiting deployment are put on the bottom of their players' combat decks in any order, and once again, it's time to continue exploring. James and Dayton decide to take the path through previously explored territories and make their way to the third campaign event. Another goblin encounter has been set up, and once again, James will go first. He puts the top 2 cards of his deck into his awaiting deployment slots. He takes an action to draw a card, then takes an action to deploy a brash novice in front of an enraged berserker, and takes his final 2 actions to deploy his allegiant pikeman in front of a destructive saboteur. He chooses for his pikeman to attack the treacherous brawler and his novice to attack the destructive saboteur. Dayton starts by putting his top 2 units in his empty awaiting deployment slots, then takes an action to draw. He takes an action to deploy a novice in front of the treacherous brawler and takes an action to deploy his scholar in front of the quarry slave. For his final action, he draws another card. He then chooses for both his novice and proctor to attack the saboteur. The roll for energy abilities this turn is 8, and no units use any energy abilities. The treacherous brawler is fatigued by the allegiant pikeman, and the destructive saboteur receives 3 damage from the other allied attackers. The rockslinger in reserves fills the now empty slot, and enemies attack. The scholar of antiquities receives 1 damage from the slave, and both players' novices as well as James' allegiant pikeman are all fatigued from attackers. Another turn for James, and he takes an action to draw a card. He then takes an action to deploy a novice in front of an enraged berserker, takes another action to draw again, and takes his final action to deploy a bashing soldier in front of the rock slinger. He chooses for his soldier to attack the slinger and his novice to attack the saboteur. Dayton takes 2 actions to deploy his experimenting alchemist in front of the saboteur, then takes a 3rd action to use its Soothing Concoction action ability to remove a damage from his Scholar of Antiquities. He then chooses to have both his units attack the enraged berserker. The roll for energy abilities is 6. The Quarry Slave uses its Puncturing Impact energy ability, and the enraged berserker uses its Blood Frenzied Flurry ability. Both units evade this combat turn. Both the saboteur and rockslinger are successfully fatigued by their attackers, and then the enemies attack. The slave fatigues the Scholar of Antiquities, and the berserker fatigues James's novice. It's James' turn once again, and he takes an action to draw, then takes his remaining 3 actions to deploy his pikeman in front of the slave and his novice in front of the berserker. His pikeman and soldier team up on the berserker, and his novice attacks the slave. Dayton, liking the card he sees on top of his deck with the information he's getting from his clairvoyant proctor, decides to not take any actions and simply attack the slave with his alchemist. The roll for energy abilities is once again 6, and the goblins both evade, managing to hold down the fort for another turn against the allied attacks. The pikeman and novice are both fatigued. James takes 2 actions and draws 2 cards, then deploys his skilled smithy in front of the quarry slave. Both his smithy and soldier attack the enraged berserker. Dayton deploys his proctor in front of the berserker and has both his units team up on it as well. The roll for energy abilities is 5, which means the quarry slave gets to use Puncturing Impact for the 3rd turn in a row. The berserker is finally fatigued, immediately bringing down the brawler in reserves. Both the smithy and proctor are fatigued from attackers. James takes all 4 of his actions to deploy his gold-rated unit, Tamara Dragonsbane, in front of the treacherous brawler, then chooses to have her attack the brawler and his soldier to attack the slave. Dayton still refuses to draw, deciding that there's no way that the slave could use Puncturing Impact 4 turns in a row. He attacks it with his alchemist. The roll for energy abilities this turn is 11, and no units use any abilities, and so the encounter is over. Many of Dayton and James' units were fatigued, and this encounter was pretty disastrous, but they've decided to continue to explore and not rest yet. James and Dayton move east and discover more colossal peaks. After rolling a 10, they trigger the High Ground event. They'll face 5 world enemies total, but enemies can't attack during their first turn. If they win, they get a treasure card for their victory spoils. The combat has been set up, and we can see the pilfering dreader is on familiar ground. He gets to use his robbery energy ability off of an additional number. As per usual, James will take his turn first. Since it's turn 1, he starts with 2 units awaiting deployment. He takes an action to draw a card, then takes 2 to deploy a field medic in front of a bloodbat, and takes his final action to deploy a bashing soldier in front of the pilfering dreader. James has his field medic attack the accursed specter, and his soldier attack the pilfering dreader. Dayton takes his top 2 cards and puts them in awaiting deployment as well. He takes 1 action to deploy Bothvar the Spiteful, which requires he fatigues the top card of his combat deck, but is an extremely efficiently costed traveler. Dayton takes his remaining 3 actions to deploy his Master Elementalist in front of the Ragged Skeleton. He chooses for Bothvar to attack the Spectre and the Elementalist to attack the Skeleton. The roll for energy abilities this turn is 5. Both the Accursed Spectre and the Pilfering Dreader use their energy abilities. The Dreader uses Robbery, putting James and Dayton's treasure in the expended treasure slot. It also evades. The Accursed Spectre uses Ethereal Ambush, which would have let it attack before allied units this turn, but because the players are on high ground, enemy units don't attack during their first turn. Still, the Spectre evades, and only the Elementalist successfully attacks the Ragged Skeleton, dealing 1 damage to it. James takes his first 2 actions this turn, drawing cards. Then he takes an action to use his Bashing Soldier's Veteran Status ability, which gives it an additional energy and lets it use one of its energy abilities off an additional number. As his last action, James takes his Novice in awaiting deployment, puts it on the bottom of his combat deck, and replaces it with the top card of his combat deck. This type of card filtering can be a good way to keep your combat deck stocked with cards while clearing up your awaiting deployment space. James has his soldier attack the Pilfering Dreader again, and his medic attack the Spectre again. Dayton takes his first 2 actions drawing cards, then takes an action to use his Elementalist's Shock of Lightning ability, dealing 1 damage to the Bloodbat. He takes his last action to draw a card, and has his Elementalist attack the Bloodbat and Bothvar attack the Spectre. The roll for energy abilities this turn is 11, and Dayton's gold-rated unit, Talman Corcel, uses its Fiery Disintegration energy ability from awaiting deployment. It deals 4 damage to any enemy unit, which is massive damage. Dayton deals 4 damage to the Brush Viper in reserves, fatiguing it, and the Bloodbat, Accursed Spectre, and Pilfering Dreader are all fatigued from attackers, leaving only the Ragged Skeleton remaining, which attacks the Elementalist, dealing 2 damage to it. James takes 2 actions to use his Field Medic's Emergency Surgery ability, which removes 2 damage from Dayton's Elementalist. He doesn't take any more actions, and has his deployed units attack the Skeleton. Dayton also doesn't take any actions, and has his units attack the Skeleton as well. They roll a 10 for energy abilities, once again letting Talman use his Fiery Disintegration ability. The Skeleton is extremely fatigued, and the encounter is over. James and Dayton shuffle their expended treasure back into the treasure deck and receive a new treasure card as their victory spoils, this time a smoke bomb. The players next head south and begin to try and explore the winding caverns. This terrain can have some bad outcomes if the players roll low. Thankfully, they roll a 10, so they'll have to face 6 enemies, and if they win, they'll get a treasure card as their victory spoils. The encounter has been set up, and we see that the Bloodbat is on familiar ground. It has a bonus attack and energy inside the caverns. James goes first and starts with his 2 cards. He takes an action to draw, deploys a field medic in front of a Bloodbat, and a novice in front of the Feral Yar. Both his units attack the Bloodbat. Dayton starts with his 2 cards, takes an action to draw, then takes his remaining 3 actions to deploy his Master Elementalist in front of the Accursed Spectre, and then chooses to attack it. The roll for energy abilities is 9, and James chooses for his Field Medic to resuscitate rather than evade, and Dayton has his Master Elementalist use Fire and Ice, dealing 1 damage to the Bloodbat and 1 damage to the Feral Yar. And finally, James chooses for his Brash Novice to evade instead of use Frenzy. Allied units attack, fatiguing the Bloodbat and dealing 1 damage to the Accursed Spectre. The Man-Eating Spider comes down from the reserve slot and enemies attack. The Spider deals 2 damage to the Field Medic, the Novice evades the R, the Vermis deals 1 damage to each player's combat deck, fatiguing the top cards, and the Spectre deals 2 damage to the Elementalist. Time for James to take another turn. He takes 2 actions and draws 2 cards. Takes a third action to deploy his Bashing Soldier in front of the Vermis, and finally uses the soldier's Veteran status ability to get an additional energy. His medic attacks the Yar, his soldier attacks the Spider, and his novice attacks the Vermis. He's anticipating Dayton using Talman Corcell's Blazing Rain action ability. Dayton does use Talman's ability, dealing 1 damage to each enemy, including the Brush Viper in reserves. Then he uses his Elementalist's Shock of Lightning ability to deal 1 more damage to the Viper, fatiguing it. Then he chooses for his Elementalist to attack the Spectre. The roll for energy abilities is 10, and Talman would be able to use his Fiery Disintegration ability, but all of the enemies are going to be fatigued from attackers anyway. The encounter was a smashing success. For their victory spoils, the players receive a Scroll of Swiftness, a silver-rated treasure card. The players head northwest and discover the Dark Dungeon. Upon rolling a 12, the players find hidden treasure and receive a treasure card, a very rare event indeed. The treasure acquired is smelling salts. The players decide to move on. They head northeast this time and find themselves in the scorching desert, which requires that each player fatigues the top 2 cards of their combat deck. They will receive an achievement point for exploring it, but it comes at a cost. Both of their combat decks are running dangerously low on cards. Dayton has 4 cards remaining in his deck, James has 5. Once one player loses, all players lose. They decide to risk it and head east again, discovering another scorching desert. Both players once again fatigue the top 2 cards of their deck. With only 2 cards remaining in Dayton's deck and 3 in James', the players decide to use their 1 rest and shuffle all their fatigued units back into their deck, and then go to the final campaign event and face the boss of this mission at full strength. Players will face 6 campaign enemies, the boss, Zealot Pash Wigworm, and will have their first encounter that includes the campaign character, Jonas Alger. The encounter has now been set up, and I'm going to briefly talk about bosses and campaign characters. Bosses do not attack and have a variety of different energy abilities. They use their abilities before all other units. They cannot be directly attacked until both of the middle front row enemy slots are cleared. Campaign characters are units that also cannot attack and have a series of energy abilities that assist allies in combat. They use their abilities right before allies use theirs. The encounter starts like any other, and James chooses to go first. He starts with the top 2 cards in awaiting deployment. He deploys his Allegiant Pikeman in front of a Rock Slinger and his Bashing Soldier in front of the Treacherous Brawler. He takes his last action to use his soldier's Veteran status ability, and has both his units attack the Chanting Shaman. Dayton starts with his 2 units. He uses Tristan Master Tactician's Ready the Reinforcements ability on himself, then deploys Tristan in front of the Deranged Bomber, and the Novice in front of the Chanting Shaman. He has Tristan attack the Rock Slinger, and the Novice attack the Bomber. The roll for energy abilities is 8. First, the boss uses Focused Absorption, which deals 1 damage to a random deployed allied unit, as well as makes both players fatigue the top 2 cards of their combat decks. James rolls to see which ally is randomly hit, and it's his Allegiant Pikeman, which ordinarily would have been fatigued, but Jonas Alger's passive ability gives all deployed allied units an additional energy. Jonas uses his Vicious Blow energy ability and deals 2 damage to the Quarry Slave in reserves. Both Tristan and the Bashing Soldier use their Evade energy abilities as well. Both the Chanting Shaman and Rock Slinger are fatigued from attackers, and both Tristan and the Bashing Soldier evade the Bomber and Brawler's attacks. James and Dayton are off to a great start this encounter, and it's James' turn again. He takes an action to draw, then takes 3 actions to use his deployed Pikeman's Impale ability, which deals 2 damage to any enemy unit in the front row. He deals 2 damage to the Treacherous Brawler and has both his units attack the Deranged Bomber. Dayton takes 2 actions to draw 2 cards, then takes an action to use his Elementalist's Shock of Lightning ability to deal 1 damage to the treacherous brawler, fatiguing it. The second deranged bomber immediately replaces it from reserves. Dayton takes his last action to draw another card. He chooses for both his novice and Tristan to attack the bomber from reserves. The roll for energy abilities is 8 again. Once again, Pash Wigworm uses Focused Absorption, this time randomly damaging Tristan Master Tactician and having both players fatigue another 2 cards from the tops of their combat decks. Jonas uses Vicious Blow to deal 2 damage to Pash Wigworm, and both Tristan and the Bashing Soldier evade again. One deranged bomber is fatigued from attackers, and the other receives 3 damage. The soldier evades the bomber's attack. James takes 3 actions to draw 3 cards and fills the rest of his remaining empty awaiting deployment slots. He then takes his last action to put a novice awaiting deployment on the bottom of his combat deck and replace it with the top card of his combat deck. There are no more enemy units in the middle 2 front row enemy slots, so James decides to have both his units attack the boss. Dayton takes an action to draw, then takes an action to use Talman Corcell's Blazing Rain action ability, dealing 1 damage to each enemy unit, then decides to have his novice attack Pash Wigworm and Tristan attack the deranged bomber. The roll for energy abilities this turn is 7. Pash Wigworm uses his Fervent Blaze energy ability, which deals 1 damage to each deployed allied unit, fatiguing James' Allegiant Pikeman. The deranged bomber then uses its Ignite Explosives energy ability, which fatigues itself, as well as a random deployed allied unit. The Bashing Soldier is randomly fatigued. Jonas uses his Assertive Command ability, giving +1 attack to the deployed novice, which then attacks and deals 2 damage to Pash. James and Dayton have made quick work of Pash's army, and now just have to finish the boss as quickly as possible. James takes 2 actions to deploy another pikeman, and takes his remaining 2 actions to use his Field Medic's Emergency Surgery ability from awaiting deployment, removing 2 damage from Tristan. His pikeman attacks Pash. Dayton takes all 4 of his actions to deploy Talman Corcell into the last empty deploy slot. All of his deployed units attack Pash as well. The roll for energy abilities is 6. Pash uses Fervent Blaze again, dealing 1 damage to each deployed allied unit. Dayton's novice is fatigued. Jonas uses Assertive Command, giving Talman +1 attack this combat turn, and the allied attackers deal 7 damage to Pash, dealing the exact damage necessary to fatigue him. James and Dayton receive 1 achievement point for each world map card explored, and subtract 3 points for each defeat in an encounter. They managed to not be defeated in any encounter and explored 14 world map cards for a total of 14 achievement points. They achieve silver rating and get a silver treasure reward. After they've completed the entire campaign, their grand total is calculated by adding their achievement score from every mission together. That concludes this second playthrough video. I hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to visit travelersofstoria.com to look at the rules as well as the various cards, and join the forums.